morning. It's Davina Stanley here with Cutting Through, and today I've got Cerise Uden with me. Cerise is a business program manager with a really deep experience looking at a broad range of programs, particularly, but not only in finance, and very often where there's a technology and change management lens. And today she's preparing for a new role, and I wanted to talk with her about the sorts of things that she thinks about in entering a new role, where she's got to engage senior leaders very quickly, very soon. So she doesn't have a lot of time to prepare and get to know people. So I think there's a lot for us to talk about today. So hello, Cerise. So great to talk to you.
Hi, Deb. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. So why don't you tell us a little bit about you to begin with? So we've got a sense of your background and what you do, and then we'll dive into this preparation that you've been doing.
Sure. I've been in the project space for about 14 years. Prior to that, I was doing business analysis, but 14 years solid project management experience. I came from New Zealand and immigrated to Australia. I had some family here, but I'd never worked in the banking industry before. I didn't even know what a project was when I first started. But I think the challenge of coming to a new country, and people often think Australia, New Zealand, same. It's not. It's not. It was a big change to come and work in an industry I'd never worked in before, get to know a city. I came from a very small school. From the age of 5 to the age of 12, we had one classroom for children from 5 to 12 years old, and there was a maximum of 21 kids. And I moved to Sydney, which was enormous. I'd never seen that many people. And to go into a corporate environment in my first job here was a little bit daunting. But I think what I really, enjoyed was the problems that came along. And so what got me into project management was I'm quite a curious person. I kind of think of myself as being a bit like Sherlock Holmes. And I like to solve problems. And so, I started quite junior. I was just typing up documentation, and then we found that there were some issues with some of the processes, so I got involved with that. And then over time that sort of morphed into more senior roles, which morphed into business analysis. And then my boss at the time said, I think you've got a knack for project management. And I didn't really understand what that was, but she gave me my first project management role, and I did my studies. I did the diploma of project management. It took me a couple of years just because I was doing it part-time with family, working around 2 young kids. Mm-hmm. And what that also gave me, though, was as I was learning, I could apply. And so once I'd done that, I got a couple of decent projects under my belt. My first project was to take infrastructure, telephony and infrastructure, and take it from one big provider and put it into another. And we had over 300 different incoming lines with all the different, you choose option 1 for this and option 2. I memorized about 700 of those in order to be able to do all the testing and things like that. And at the end of it, my boss said, I don't think you realize what you've done. And I hadn't anything on which to compare it with, but clearly I had a knack for it. So that was my first project, and then it just grew from there. So I did that as a project manager, and the next one was more infrastructure based. And so whilst we were doing the shift from provider to provider, it wasn't as technical. And so this one was a lot more technical. We were looking at disaster recovery, business continuity. And so we had to understand how, as a virtual center, it was going to work together. So that was great. I like to get under the hood. I like to understand how things work. And by the time I'd finished that project, I was ready to do my certification. And I did my first one with the Australian Institute of Project Management, so AOPM. So I got my certified practicing project manager, and then continued to do more projects, become more senior, and move into the program role, which I've been doing for a few years now. And over that time, I also got my PMI PMP certification, so the project management professional.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so that's a bit about where I've come from.
Yeah. And now you're about to start a new role. And I'm just listening to your journey, this sort of incremental and sometimes big steps, sometimes, incremental journey towards bigger and more complex things. And in the time I've known you, I think you've been working on really large programs of work, which have had that sort of technology lens quite often. There's a lot of change management that comes with that and other sorts of things. And now you're coming into a new role. And I think you've had this, I think, been contracting for a while. So you're moving from environment to environment. And that brings a certain set of skills where you've got to set up really quickly. And now you're engaging very senior people. You have been for a while. So you know what's required, but you've got a whole lot of new people, a whole lot of new circumstances. So this new project you're coming into, you've got to do a business case and also at the same time wrap up, take over a project that's in flight. And so tell us a little bit about the preparation you're doing to help you get in the zone really quickly and engage senior people and get the actions that you need really quickly.
I was thinking about this. Obviously, I'm in the process actually doing it now, so it's a good opportunity, I think, for me to reflect on that. I mentioned in my sort of background that I like to get under the hood. I like to get under the covers. So one of the first things that I always sort of start to do is get the lay of the land. The first part of that is looking at the org structure for the company, and that helps me twofold. One, it gives me a sense of how the company is divided up, and two, it tells me who the people who are influential across that organization are. And it helps me when I'm placing the people that I'm working with and working for within that broader organization. So that's one of the first things I do is get my hands on the org chart and start working. I just start at the top and work my way down and figure out who's who in the zoo.
And do you LinkedIn stalk them?
I do, actually.
Yeah.
I find the thing with LinkedIn too is because it's got a bit of background about them, you can kind of, you don't know them, but it can give you just a little sense about where they might be coming from. And that then is, I think, the next key thing for me is who is it that I'm here to deliver for? And what do they need? And so I'm always about the outcome. I think that's probably why I was, naturally drawn to project management. And I do try to spend time before I get there on the first day, based on information I would have got from interviews and things like that, to actually put myself in their shoes and try and understand, okay, I know this particular program, I've got to deliver this very high level outcome that they've given me, but if I were that person, what would I be looking for? And something that I find quite useful, I know it's probably a little bit old and a little bit cliche, etc., but is the SMART goals piece. And it fits really well with project management, but I think it fits very well with anything.
Oh, I do too. Yeah.
Because firstly, you've got to be specific, right? So what specifically am I here to do? So I heard this somewhere, but someone would say, if they ask me to come and paint their house, okay, I know I'm here to paint a house, but now I need to know what color, what type of paint, do you want me to paint all the sides of the house the same colors? So I do spend a bit of time thinking about, if I understand what the ultimate end outcome is, what are some of the things that I need to know to get really specific on that outcome?
And how do you unpack that? Because I think, the idea of getting in someone's shoes is universal thought, but how you actually do it, I think it's one of the hardest things we actually do. So getting specific and using the SMART framework, absolutely. But how do you work out what colors of paint and whether it's lead paint or acrylic paint and all of that for your projects? How do you dig in?
Well, I think it's the questions, right? So I may not know the answers they're going to give me, but I can at least think about if I need to get clear on what they're thinking they're gonna. I always break it down to what do they imagine on the day that it's done, it's gonna look like, it's gonna feel like. What do they think people are going to be saying? What do they think people are going to be doing? For example, I did a project where I set up an offshore call center. And I'd never done that before, but I just sat there and I thought, well, if I were the owner of the call center, I'd imagine, and we were starting from scratch, I'd imagine that, we need carpet on the floors, we need chairs to sit on, we need desks to put computers on, we need computers. And so I start to form that picture. And so then I just start to write the questions. So do you want carpet on the floor? What kind of chairs do you want? In terms of network, do you want a full desktop? Do you want laptops so they can take them home? So when I think about preparing for the first conversations I'm going to get to have with the sponsor or the person who's delegated on behalf of them, those are the kinds of things that I start to prepare for. So I might not be able to answer the question, but I'll have the questions to get.
Bingo. Yeah. No, that's what I was wondering. How do you get the answers, but you don't need them? You just need the questions.
Yes.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. Okay. No, beautiful. And so do you want to work through the SMART framework as to how you tackle each one, or, the measurement piece you might be given a bit more steer on in advance, do you think?
Well, yeah, I think, again, so in preparation for this role, I've got like 3 or 4 pages of questions. And so using the SMART, so the specific is, okay, if I need to put this application in, what do I need to know about that application? So I need a specific outcome. How will I know that I've successfully done that? When do they need me to do it? So, measuring is, I know SMART goals are time bound as well, but a measurement is time, and cost is a measurable item. How many resources am I going to get? That's measurable. Where's our schedule? And so do we have sprints? Are we doing waterfall? I use the SMART piece to prompt the kinds of things that I need to be thinking about. Because, when you think measurable, I'm like, what are all the things that I can measure on this? Do we have a risk register? Have we thought about any dependencies? And it prompts me to do it that way. And with the achievable, they've given me a time frame in which to deliver the first project, and I understand the timeframes that they're aiming for business case. My question is, what have they done so far? And talk me through where you're at now. What have you done so far? How confident are you that you can achieve that date? And why are you confident about that? And often what I'll find is the confidence will be parallel to the amount of planning that they've done. And so if it's a really urgent project, confidence will be low. And so when it comes to answering the question around achievable, they'll be a bit iffy. And so that's one of the things I know I need to hone in on when I get started is, all right, let's work out what's going to really determine if we can achieve the time frame or the cost or, the outcome that you're asking for. So I use the SMART, probably not in its traditional way, but in a way that prompts me to think about those things. So,
but that's what these frameworks are great for, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's to prompt you to think. Ultimately, that's what they're for.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think Go
I,
on.
I think what it allows me to do is let my mind just go everywhere. And I have a tendency to do that anyway. I'll hear somebody say something and I'll make a note because maybe it's not the appropriate forum in which to have a more detailed conversation. But I'm like, that's a little red flag. I should make a note of that. And so that sort of more structured thinking that I can follow prompts those little red flags that I can make notes for and ask questions on.
Yeah, yeah, beautiful, beautiful. And so this particular role you're coming into, how much time are you investing in actually getting to know you've got a little bit of extra time this week, so I know you've invested in it heavily. I don't know if that's normal for the amount of time you would spend, or, tell us a little bit about your process for, getting into the zone for a new role.
So I would normally spend at least a good part of 2 days preparing to go into the role. So the first day is a big brain dump, like I just talked about, where I come up with all the questions. The second day, and sometimes I'll do this a little bit out before I start the role. Sometimes I'll do it closer to the actual role. Just depends on what's going on in life. But the second day, I actually use it to try and chunk all the questions together. So I know I'm not going to get a lot of time. I'm not going to be able to sit down for hours and hours at a time and get all the information at one point. So what I try to do in that second day is take the questions I've got and group them together. And then from that, decide which are the ones that are most important to me to get to first. And I also think about, okay, what's day one likely to look like? They're going to be introducing me to everybody. People probably won't have time in their calendars yet. That could take a little while to get into. So I try to go, all right, if I can get my hands on this person, this is what I want to be ready with. So it's about preparing for the opportunity so that when they can get me into their diaries, I'm good to go. I already know what I'm going to need to ask.
Yeah.
So that's what I usually do in preparing to go into the role. And then on the first day, generally, they'll take me around, introduce me to everybody, but I'll get me time as well. And I'll use that to start digging into the org structure. So go online, have a look, figure out who's who, and from the people that I'm meeting, start to connect some of the dots. And then the next few days are generally just taking it all in through meetings. But in those me times where I've got the focus time, I then, like I did with the org structure, I start trying to find the processes that they have. And I start looking for the architecture diagrams where there's technology involved. And it's one of the first things I try and do is get time with the architects. And they're always excited by that, right? I think it's a good way to win some brownie points in the first few days in the role, is they like talking about their stuff. And so I try to make time with them and ask if they can send me links to their diagrams or any other information that's related to what we're doing. And I try to get as big a picture of how it fits into the organization as possible. And then in the meetings, just get them to walk me through the architecture. Now, I don't have a technical background, but they say a picture paints 1,000 words. And so looking at the diagram and having them explain, the upstream, the downstream, the inputs, the outputs, I can start to form a bit of an understanding. Okay, I'll make a note that if information is coming from here, we need to be prepared to talk to those people. If information is going to there, we need to be prepared to talk to those people. And so by looking at the architecture and the processes and having already looked at the org chart, I can start to very quickly piece together the world that I'm going to be working in. So yeah, that's generally how I'd spend my first few days in an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm assuming you can't get those appointments in diaries before you actually start, can you? Once you've done your, you
No, no.
doing your org chart and understanding who's who in the zoo and so on. But then also, I suppose in some really structured environments, those meetings would be given to you by the people who've hired you in, say, right, there's some people you need to meet. I've put them in your diary. So there might be a bit of that too. You might not have to drive all of that yourself at the very
That's right. Yeah. So in this particular case, there is a PM who was working on the project that's in flight, and so they'll be doing handover with me. And so there'll be a certain number of meetings and an engagement model that already exists, and I'll just slot into those. The challenge with those is that there's a lot of assumptions that people already come with, and they assume that I know. And so it's really important to be listening for those assumptions. The PM who's moving out, he will be there for 3 weeks. So I've got to make sure that anything that is assumed knowledge, I try and get across or identify as quickly as possible. Yeah.
Okay. And what are your tricks for identifying those assumptions? Is it just, well, hang on, I don't know the answer to that. What's that? Is it as simple as that, or is there something more to it?
No, I actually think it's, I didn't realize it, but a lot of people actually find it quite difficult. It's listening. And I don't think listening is, you know, a really understood skill.
No, it's not.
I've done coaching courses and leadership courses and a lot of that over time, and a lot of what you learn in those is listening skills. And I think if I'm trying to help people to sort of hone those skills, it's really looking for what's not being said. And if I'm sitting there and I hear someone say something, and in my head I'm like, but what about this? I think, and nobody else mentions it, then I think there's an assumption in there. And so that's one of those things where a little red flag will go off, and I'll make a note. If it's appropriate in the meeting, I'll raise it there, because I think other people are probably thinking the same thing, but just sort of haven't thought to ask. But if not, then I'll make notes of them and I'll go away and I'll reach out to them offline and say, can I just clarify this? Or, one of my common lines is, just checking my understanding, and going from there.
Yeah. And so it really is listening and just those little questions that, oh, what's that? How does that work? Yes. And watching everyone else's responses to see how they are in the meeting at the time. Yeah.
And the other thing is, if they all just nod and agree, it means I don't know. I could be the only one that doesn't know, so I need to ask anyway. So whether they know and I'm the only one, or whether none of us know, I need to ask the question.
Yes, and sometimes people are nodding because they feel like they should know as well. Yeah.
That's right.
So it's like, oh, thank goodness there's a new person. She can ask all the questions I wanted to ask.
That's right. I take advantage of I'm the newbie. I get to ask all the dumb questions. So
brilliant. Yeah. And the joy of this project that you're going into is you're going into an organization you've been in before. So this is not just a case of where you're going into a new organization, but when you're going into a new role in an existing, client, or just moving seats. But when you do go into a new organization, are there any things that you find that you do that are different?
I think I tend to do the same thing. I learned a while ago that having a system makes things quicker and easier, and so I do tend to rinse and repeat. I think the big difference in going into an organization I've never worked in before is you can look at an org structure, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how the company works.
I was going to ask you about that, the formal and the informal influence, and just the way things are supposed to work versus the way they actually work.
That's right. Yes.
How do you get under the hood of that? How do you work that out quickly?
First, I'll start with the person that I am reporting to. So as my manager, they'll understand that I will be wanting to get that next level of detail. And they should also be the ones to help open the doors for me, introduce me to the right people. So one of the things I find varies with my managers is, you're a fairly senior person, so they expect you to come in and just hit the ground running on your own. And you can,
yeah,
but you do need at least for the first couple of weeks, until people know who you are and have a concept of the project and how you fit in, or the work that you're doing, how you fit in, to at least make those initial introductions in a space that you wouldn't naturally be going into. So this particular project, not the one with the business case, but the one that's in flight, it's across the entire group. Now, that organization has like 40,000 people, and we'll be rolling out different frameworks for different roles across that entire organization. So there's going to be a lot of people in there that I don't know. And for this one in particular, even though I've been in the organization before, I've not been a part of this division that will be rolling the changes out. So I'm going to rely on in this case, the product owner to be pointing me in the right direction. Now, I don't necessarily need them to set up the meetings or to do a formal introduction. I can do those as long as I know who to start with. And I always go in, hi, I'm Cerise, I'm starting on this program of work. I'm working with Mrs. Smith, and she's suggested I reach out to you. And I'll always CC that person who's pointed me towards the stakeholder, so that there's that connection there, and they can kind of go, oh, okay, you're tied to that person. They may not know me specifically, but they understand why I'm reaching out. And sometimes particularly if you're looking at GM level, reaching out to their exec assistants, building relationships with exec assistants,
oh yes,
like that, that's definitely worth it. And most of them I find they're very willing to help, and they'll pretty much do anything for you as long as you are helping yourself, so be prepared, be very clear about what you need their time for, be flexible. So, if you're working with GMs, they often don't have a lot of time in their diary, so you need to be prepared to move around them, and that kind of thing. So, yeah, that's another way that I tackle it.
Yes, no, executive assistants are your best friend always. Yep. Absolutely. No, yep. That's right. And all right, so finding the introductions to the people, leverage the people that you've been introduced to who are on your team or you're working with, obviously, to get the introductions to them. Yeah. Tell us about the most difficult situation that you've had when you've started in a new role, and you've gone in and you've done your prep and just stuff isn't working like it should. Like, what are the barriers that you come across? Like, when it goes wrong, what are the things?
I think the biggest, probably the most common problem is assumptions. So everyone agrees, okay, the outcome is to roll out the framework, but what that looks and feels like hasn't actually been articulated. And so for some, it might be even down to a date, for example. So I get told the completion date is, say, the 31st of March. Let's go with that, right? And so I'll start talking to people, and the completion means different things to different people. And so probably the biggest challenge is where they haven't spent the time with each of the key decision makers to make sure that they're all on the same page for those key milestones. That means the same thing to them, even if the process of getting there needs to be different for each group. So, for example, in this case, we have operations, we have HR, we have a branch network, we have technology, but we've got to roll it out to all of them, and it's going to be different for all of them. So it's really important that the end outcome and things like dates and what success looks like has been articulated with each of them. And all of it will be the frameworks rolled out, but then what does that mean for each one?
Yes.
So I invest a lot of time upfront when I get with those people of that process I talked about earlier. So what are you expecting on the day that we're done? What does that look and feel like? What are you expecting, your team leaders to be doing? What do you expect the people to be doing? What will be different that day to the day before, and things like that. So I think when you're really clear on what the outcome is, and you apply the SMART to it, right? It's specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, it's relevant, and it's time bound. Then everything else you're doing is focused on getting to that point. And so it's much easier to have conversations when other things come up. Risks come up all the time, issues come up all the time. But if you are very clear on the outcome you're trying to get to, it's much easier to have conversations to solve the problems to help you get to that. So I think where I've picked up something before, or even in running multiple concurrent programs and projects at the same time, maybe the members in the team are not as experienced, and so they think they've got a very clear, yes, we're doing this by this date. In my own space, I've had to go back and get everybody back on the same page. So it can be when you're taking over from someone on another project. It can be within your own space, because you can't be all things to everybody all the time, and something new. So it always comes back to being very clear what is the outcome that you want, and makes it much easier to have conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And so have you had a situation where you've gone in and let's say you've got 4 or 5 key decision makers for a program of work, and one or more of them have said, oh, hang on, that's not the end line. The end line is here. Or actually, no, the end line's way back here in the journey. If you find that, what do you do?
So the last program I worked on, it had actually been running for about 10 years. It was and I say that because it was a big program of work to uplift a lot of the platforms and infrastructure and processes to then be able to implement it into the business. So a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort has gone into getting to a point where the business can start using it. Now, they started trying to roll it out in this particular channel about 8 months before I got involved. And it was stopped because there wasn't a clear understanding of what they were trying to achieve by when. They needed to roll out, and they were starting to do that. But because, again, rolling out meant different things to different people, and they hadn't clarified what each of the stakeholder groups was expecting for that, they had to stop and do a big reassessment. And that's the point at which I came in. And when I asked, what does completing rollout mean, I got 5 different responses.
Yes.
And for some, it was, we've rolled out the platform, but not everyone's on it. For some, it was, we've rolled out the platform and everyone is on it. And for some, it was, we've rolled out the platform in part, and we've got everybody using that part, but everybody is also still using the other platforms because we haven't transitioned all of the processes and capability onto the new platform. So you had all of these different views, and I'm like, well, which one is it? So going back to, like a systems, it's workshop, sit down, get very clear. What's the thing that can't change here? Now, they'd made a commitment to the board, and therefore that commitment is what drives everything else that happens, right? So we started with that commitment, which was a time frame in which they will have completed the thing. So then the next question was, what is the thing? What did you tell the board that you would have done by that date? And again, there were varying opinions on what had been committed to. Ultimately, what we got to was they told the board that they would have started to transition users from the old platform onto the new platform by this particular date. But then the question was, did we tell them when we would finish it? So everyone had made an assumption that we had to have it all finished by the date given to the board. But no, we made a commitment we would start. So they hadn't actually made a commitment of when they would finish, which gave us a little bit more flexibility. So that gave me the opportunity to then, on a big whiteboard's my favorite thing.
And see that you've got one behind you right here.
We actually mapped out on the whiteboard all of the steps in the thing. And okay, if our commitment to the board so far is to start by this date, what do we have to have done by then? And then the next thing is, they're going to ask you when you're going to finish. Even if we haven't told them that yet, we need to be ready. So with that opportunity to look at what's achievable, right? We then worked out, well, if we do this at this time, if we plan a bit of contingency because things go wrong.
Always.
And we build that in as well, we feel, relatively confident that we could deliver by this date. So then I drew that line and I said, so in a perfect world, and I always start with the perfect world, right? Like if we could do anything we wanted, what would that look like? In a perfect world, if we can get agreement from the board to the finish date, this is what that would look like. Yes, great. So we did end up being in a position to communicate that to them. And we did lock in that end outcome. So from that point on, all of the governance meetings, all of the status reporting was, we're starting on this date, how are we tracking to that? And what's going to ensure that we track to the finish date that we're committing to as well. And so I know I sound like a broken record, but it's that really getting clear on the outcomes. And it's so transferable too, right? So, I always think when I go into a new role, new company, same companies, doesn't matter, but I need to put on my oxygen mask first. So what is expected of me and what outcomes do I want from this project, from this opportunity? But then it flows from there. It's what do my sponsors want? How do I make sure that I am very clear on that outcome? What do each of the individual stakeholders need to support that sponsor? So I keep going back to that, but it's
absolutely
a repeatable process.
Yeah, absolutely. But there must be a bit of an art also to going from, okay, we worked out now what we, just using your example there. So this is what we've got to deliver. This is what we've promised, right? We've now got clear on what we actually promised. Good news. And then now we've all agreed when we're going to deliver the whole package, right? But then holding back on telling too much too soon about what that actual final deadline is going to be must be a little bit of an art, because you're new in the role, you're trusting the people you're working with, but at the same time, I can imagine you don't want to put your foot in it and put that line in the sand too publicly immediately.
Yes.
Like you might trust it, but you think actually prudently, I just want to really test this. It's a bit like a bit of your own oxygen mask stuff.
Yes.
What's your thought process there? How do you decide when to let the board know or the senior sponsors know this is really when we're going to deliver the whole package?
So that example I gave, which is kind of the standard process, which is workshopping, that generally everyone in that workshop will walk away and they'll have information in their head, but then they'll just go back to their day jobs. Exactly. And it's my job to then take it all and put it all down on paper. And a big part of that is, what are the risks that I can think of. And we'll have come up with a lot during the workshop, and I'll have been taking those down as well. As we were making decisions around, well, if we do this by this date, then it'll allow us to start this, etc. There'll be risks all the way through those conversations. So it's my job to take that away and sit down and document all of those, and then spend a little time with the right people to discuss how would we mitigate those. Once we've had those conversations, and I will generally try and run a full risk workshop to focus on those as well. It allows you to then identify what your high risks are and what steps you think you can take to address those, and get buy-in from the people who will help you to address those. Once I've done that, then I take it back to, I will usually have a weekly working group where we sit down and we go, right, we talked about this, these are the dates, we've looked at the risks, we've identified these as high, mediums, low. The biggest risks to meeting the commitment to the board are these. We believe by putting these mitigants in place or taking these steps, we can minimize the risk of that happening. But if it did, the impact of that would be whatever that is. And so through that, I think we start to get a sense of our confidence as a group. And it's only at that point where we feel like we've thoroughly assessed the risks that we would be prepared to put our hands up and say, we want to go for this date, or we may have reassessed it and for these reasons, instead of going for, you know, the 1st of May, we've decided we're going to go for the 1st of June. You know, that's generally the process I'll go through.
Absolutely. And I love the way you're talking about fleshing out those risks, because one of the things that senior leaders and board members will tell me is that if they're not seeing the risks written down as the thing that really keeps the people up at night, if it's no, all good, no problem, yeah, we can do that, then it's like, oh, you talk about red flag, that's number one red flag. What are the, what have they not thought about? There've got to be risks. There's got to be things that could keep them up at night about this project. I'm not going to make examples up, but they've got to be there, and they've got to be really red and hairy. Otherwise, it shows that the people haven't thought about it.
And I think there's always going to be an assumption that you haven't done the work if they can't see it.
Correct.
So it doesn't matter how much work you've done if you're not reflecting that back to them. And it's not a token gesture. There's two things that I think really sunk in when I did my original project management training. One was the amount of planning that you do is definitely, responsible for the quality of the outcome you get. But then the second thing is the risk management piece. And a lot of people, it is time consuming. And my teams will make fun of me because I like the risk workshops. They're my favorite part because you really get to think about things. And I always have massive risk lists. Now, that doesn't mean I take all of those to the GMs or to the execs. You take the ones that are most pertinent at that time and the ones that are the highest risk, right? But in my head, if I've thought about all of those things, then at least we have them in our register. We have considered downstream impacts, upstream impacts, and even if you don't do anything with it at the time, when you're in the process, you could be 6 months down the track and you hear something, you go, oh, I remember somebody talking about a risk associated with that. You can go back and this is what we thought we could do about it. And you can jump on it early and you can go, right, we thought about this. This is what we were going to do. Let's take some steps to put that into place.
Yeah. No, I love that because it just gives you such a good tool, doesn't it?
Yeah.
For sharpening your radar. And so now you're going into, or part of the work you're doing is involving a new area, which is AI.
Yep.
And so you're going into an organization you're familiar with, but a much broader scope. And you've got, I think the business case piece is to do with AI, isn't it? It's not the existing project, it's the business case work. Is that
Yeah, the business case is
Yeah.
for the new project, which will include a component of AI.
AI. And so you're coming with, deep technology experience. I know you say you're not technical, but you've run such a lot of technology or technical projects, and you know how things fit together, and you understand the business side of it all. How have you come to terms with the AI piece? What have you done to upskill on that really quickly?
So, interestingly enough, I started looking at AI just out of my own curiosity, probably a year or two ago. I didn't know what it was, but we were starting to see little bits of it within the organizations I was working in. So little chat bots, for help functions and things like that. So initially what I started with was just trying to understand what the concept of AI was. And at a very basic level, like I try to keep things simple as possible. And another thing, I talk about looking at the architecture diagrams is seeing where I could find diagrams that sort of represent how some AI functions have been set up in different organizations, that kind of thing. I think the other thing that's prompted, curiosity around it as well is this whole chat, the GPT, if I've got that right.
Yes, you have.
Yeah, that's hitting the world at the moment, and having a play around with it, just seeing how it works and asking it lots of questions. I've got a brother who's in the construction industry, and he's a project manager in construction in New Zealand, and he works for it's not the government, but the government use them to look at their social housing, and his role is to go into these houses and assess if fit for purpose and whether they need repairs and whether they need to rebuild and things like that. But they have a lot of applications and technology that sit behind the work that they do, and he has been using it in terms of understanding trends in I don't know the right words, but in community impacts through things like elections. What have they seen in terms of housing and requests for housing and stuff like that as a result of an election and the promises made by one, group versus another? And so he's been using it to do that kind of research and that kind of thing. So it's really just been understanding how different people look at it and what the potential of it is. I understand what this particular project is hoping to get from it. And again, I've had a look at a bit of a structural diagram that looks similar to what I think we're going to do. So at this stage, that's probably the best I can do before actually getting into the organization and getting started. But yeah, very excited. It's definitely, going to change a lot of things in the future. And so being a part of that is exciting.
Isn't it? Yes. No, I've been really curious about it as well. I mean, for someone who helps people with their communication, the initial fear is, oh my gosh, it's going to do my job for me. Oh dear, and then having a really good look and concluding, no, it's not. But gee whiz, it's powerful. And one of the things that I've done is just look on Twitter and see what people are saying about it. And there's actually a whole lot of very useful threads where people are saying, well, here's how I'm using it. Here's what I'm trying. And, there's much discussion and fear in education about, oh my gosh, it's going to do my kids' homework for them. That's not okay. And sure, that's a risk. But at the same time, it can be used to really augment it as well, where, before going into a subject, or a class, a new topic or something, you can put into, a chat to say, well, what do I want to know about the pharaohs in Egypt? Or, give me a 300-word summary of World War One, or I don't know, I'm just making the examples up, but you can certainly use it to just get a synopsis on a topic and get it, a heads up. Obviously, it's only relevant according to the data that the tool has been trained on.
Yes.
Gee whiz, I sit there and I think, how useful would this be inside an organization where, let's say, all the board papers are put into a proprietary version of it, and then new board members could go in and pump questions in before their first meetings. Okay, we've got, a proposal being put forward by Cerise about Cerise's new chatbot or whatever it is. What's the board been talking about in relation to AI and chatbots? What's the history? Rather than trawling through old papers and having to go through some sort of directory. I can imagine all sorts of, institutional knowledge being put inside these sorts of environments. I don't know if that gives them enough data to make the bot really useful or not, but I can see all sorts of proprietary uses for research and just coming to terms with stuff.
And when you look at organizations, like large corporate organizations where they have, thousands of processes, one of the biggest challenges is actually getting your hands on the processes, because somebody will do them at a point in time, and back in 2010 we did this and we put it here, and then in 2018 the organization changed how it stored those processes and may not have been transitioned. So having something that can do that level of research for you could be really powerful. And I talk about, one of the first things I try and do is get into the process maps and look at the processes, but it's so hard because first you need to know where they are. Nobody ever puts them in the same place. Like, you've got an organization of 40,000 people and multiple divisions, and each division does its own way, and then within the division they do their own way as well. Something like that would just be amazing to give you a true sense of what's there. Not saying that that's the current process, because we all know, you document at a point in time and everybody morphs it. But to have that baseline to then start from. I think I was listening, I mentioned to you John Acuff. He got asked the question, he's a writer, he got asked the question about what did he have concerns about how it might affect his work and that. And he said, I would never use it to write a book because it's not my ideas, it's not me, it's not what makes the core of what I'm trying to do on a page. It will never do that. But when it comes to things like, when he's trying to advertise his book on Amazon and the blurb to go on Amazon, that would be a great tool to help, so him positioning, and some of the others that I've listened to, etc., talk about it as well. You start to get a sense of where it can be really helpful, and there'll always be fear about new technology, etc. But I think educate yourself is what's really important. Understand, and then just wait and see what happens, because everybody's panicking about something that doesn't actually exist yet. It hasn't happened. Yes, ChatGPT is there and people are using it, but all the fears are based on something that could happen in the future.
Yes. I think we're all getting worried about what are humans going to be for. With all this technology, what are humans actually going to be for?
I think we're a long way off before, that's going to be a problem for us.
I think so. Certainly not in our lifetime. Yeah, but some really, really great opportunities for us and for our kids too. Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. So what would be your top advice for somebody entering, let's just go back a step and think about yourself a while ago. Imagine going into your first sort of quite senior role, like vice president, general manager role or level role, where you need to engage super senior people. What would be your advice in stepping into that role and how you'd prepare yourself for the role, and then particularly engaging and getting to know your stakeholders?
I think the first one is use the SMART smart words. I won't say the smart method because you're not using it to set a goal, but you're using it to trigger your thinking. So use SMART to sit down and think about as much as possible, what you need, what your stakeholder needs, and then what you will need to do your job. So I think I worked it out. It was what, the who, and the how. I think those three things. So using SMART to flush that out. The second thing I do is I take all of that and I put it into a checklist, and I make sure that every day I sit down and I look at all the questions that I had and who I've been able to speak to, and make sure that I'm covering them off, because I think there's a tendency when you get in and get started to just run with things. Take the time, make the time either in the morning. I'm a morning person, so I will generally get online or be in the office well before anyone else, so I've got space without anyone pinging me or talking to me. So I can actually sit down and go through, right, what did I have that I thought I needed to cover off? Have I done that? And so making that time so you can then also identify new things that you might have found. So I think if there were three things, the first one is using the SMART to sit down and come up with all your questions and then group them. Second thing is make the list and check the list. You did it for a reason. It's there to serve you. And then the third one is getting under the covers, so taking the time to look at the org structure, get the lay of the land for how the company is set up, and then where possible, if it involves architecture, even if you're not doing an actual technical project, I think having an understanding of the infrastructure of an organization is helpful too. If you're doing just change or operational change, people use systems. And so anytime you're going to impact a process or impact a person, a human being, you potentially have to think about what's going on in that tech space as well. So yeah, I think those would be the three things: is use the SMART to help your thinking, make a checklist and use it. And then the third thing is, try and get under the covers and find ways of understanding how the org works.
Yeah. Beautiful. No, that's a beautiful summary at the end. And I think you alluded to another thing which we spoke about the other day that I might just bring into it, is get to your stakeholders early in the day. When you want to get to know them, when you've got a big sell or a big ask, then try and get to them early in the day. Unless you know that they're a night owl, get to them early in the morning before their decision fatigue kicks in, because when you are senior and you're in meetings just rolling one after the other, you run out of juice, don't you?
Yeah, and I think that was a real eye-opener, on your course, was when you took the time up front to actually talk about how much energy we use to think and to make decisions and to solve problems. And it wasn't until I went through that part of your course that it dawned on me, like, I've always thought, why am I so tired when I don't have a physical job? Yes, I do a lot of thinking and talking in meetings, but ultimately I'm not physically doing anything. But when you understand the science behind that, you can go, okay, so that's why I need to get in their calendars in the morning when they're fresh and they feel like they're ready to make decisions. So yeah, that's a good tip, actually.
No, beautiful, beautiful. So I love the way you'd interpreted what I'd said. I thought that was golden. That was brilliant. Oh, no, fantastic.
That explains so much.
It does, doesn't it? It's these tiny little tactics that are really, really helpful, aren't they? So yeah, beautiful. Look, thank you so much for giving us your time on the Friday before you start the new big gig on the Monday. So it's been a real treat to talk with you about all of those things, and I love the way you've tied it all together for us at the end. It's so helpful. So if you are listening and you'd like to learn more about Cerise or connect with her, we'll pop her LinkedIn details in the show notes. And if you'd like to see anything more about other conversations we've had on the Cutting Through podcast, please visit clarityfirstprogram.com/podcast. And we look forward to bringing more of those to you another time, also on your favorite podcast player. So we're on Spotify and Stitcher and all those other sorts of platforms. So thanks again. We look forward to talking to you again soon.